Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Best Practices in Audit Procurement Services. Before we begin, I am going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams. Jim Lanzarotta, Partner and National Practice Leader of our Government Services Group, and Kevin Mullerleile, Senior Manager with our Government Services Group. With that, I'll turn it over to Jim to get us started.
Well, hello everyone. Hope you're doing well and safe and wherever you might be. Kevin and I were realizing that we're not doing a video of ourselves presenting, and I actually am probably happy about that. I don't think you'd be able to see my eyes. I think my hair is as long as it's been since I've been in high school. I was commiserating with a friend of mine who was sharing with me how odd times are, where it is completely legal to walk into a marijuana shop and purchase products with a credit card, but in order to get your hair cut, it requires an illegal transaction in an alleyway with cash and at risk of apparently jail time. Anyway, hope you're all doing well and appreciate your flexibility to allow us to continue doing this training remotely, since we're unable to do this all together as we have for the past many years. Some of you already participated in our very first session, which was held earlier this week. And so far, the reviews on that were pretty positive. So Kevin and I have our job cut out for us to hold up expectations after that first webcast. So you're the second of a series that will get us probably close to 8 hours, I think, in total. So today, we are going to, cover a number of things. We want to cover with you some ideas about ways to increase the success of your selection process and to share some information about some challenges on your end that we're aware of and some challenges on our end. And we'll utilize some of our polling questions to share some of your comments and ideas along the way. We'll talk about the RFP process and some things to consider on both our ends. Clearly, the needs of proposers as well as some needs on your end. One thing that's becoming more and more of a challenge for audit firms over the last 5 years have been some contractual provisions. So in discussions with the staff at the AICPA, there's been a number of issues that have been shared. We'd like to bring some of those to your attention. Kevin and I had an opportunity to co-present this session once before with the Central Finance Officers Group. So those are some of your peers over in Central Oregon. And the City of Bend co-presented with us and have agreed to allow us to share some materials from their last RFP process so you could see some real examples from one of your peers. And we'll probably spend most of our time leading up to that point, but we do want to briefly go through their process so you can see what that looked like. And then there are some additional audit services that we're finding have become increasingly popular and helpful to some of our clients, and so we wanted to kind of chat with that. So to get us started, Kendall, why don't you take us through that first polling question?
All right, so for our first polling question, we have, which of these situations has been the most challenging experience you've had selecting an auditor? The options are A, we did not get the team members included in the proposal. B, the team provided did not have government experience. C, the firm did not have the desired level of governmental technical expertise. D, the firm did not meet our targeted deadlines. Or E, the team provided was not professional and/or was difficult to work with. I'll give you a few moments to respond. To participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit.
And, I think when Kevin and I put this together, we were just curious to maybe hear from you on some of the problematic areas. Obviously, we don't know what kinds of issues you all may have experienced. We do hear from some of you after proposal processes and after you've worked with firms. And obviously, when we pick up a new client, sometimes we're able to hear a few issues. And certainly, we're not immune to this. We try very hard not to provide some of these challenges on our own part. But anyway, it's always nice to kind of be aware of these things. So Kendall, let us know when we're ready to.
And these are the results.
Do I go ahead and click on that?
We can just move on to the next slide if you're ready.
Okay, there we go. So, wow, so pretty evenly. Wow, so not getting the team members is the most selected response, but this is pretty even across the board, so kind of unfortunate, but what we'd like to share as we go through here are perhaps some ways that you can try to identify if these might be issues with a particular firm that you're considering through the proposal process. So a couple things to think about as you're about to embark on a process. One is whether to do the competitive bid in the first place. And that might be strange hearing, especially here in Oregon, where you know that there is some state laws centered around purchasing goods and services. But in Oregon, there actually is an exemption provided for certain professional services, and services from an accounting firm would be included in that. Most of you have policies that require putting services out to bid, which is generally considered a best practice. One of the things that I would say here is that our experience sometimes is that a firm really likes the relationship they have with their incumbent audit firm. And if that is the case, one thing that maybe gets lost in this is for a firm to put a very good proposal together, it's quite a time effort to do that. And so from our end as audit firms, we just want to know that there really is a desire to kick the tires on firms and be very open about the selection process so that we feel good about putting that time and effort in. Time considerations, we'll talk about that a little bit. We have an example of some different timelines that are considerate of both on your end and on an audit firm's end. We're finding that different stakeholders from our auditees are interested in involvement, perhaps more so than we experienced several years ago and prior. So we'll talk about that. What are the roles of the different stakeholders? What about the document itself? And what are the things that you value, and how does that get factored into the actual request for information? Handling questions of proposers, that's an interesting one. It seems that there's a very high desire to keep the process of responding to questions transparent and open, and so the pendulum has really swung. And we'll talk about some challenges when the only source that we have to go through to get technical questions or scope questions answered is folks from procurement, without access to you all that have the knowledge that we're after. So we'll talk about that. And then whether to do interviews or not, and what some information you can glean from that. And so with that, Kevin, why don't you walk us through some of the issues about clarifying roles?
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a good morning. I think all of these roles are involved in the process in one way or the other. Kind of start to the right. Certainly purchasing is always involved in the RFP process. They're there to ensure that the organization's following its procurement policies. There's no inappropriate contacts that occur during the RFP process that would be outside of those policies. And really had good working relationships with purchasing because I find that they're often open to helping bidders walk through the process. And I understand they have challenges. They're not only working with audit firms. Audit firm may bid once every 5 years, maybe 10 years, who knows. At the same time, they might be working on a contract for a public project with construction firms. So a lot of different organizations to deal with through this process. Finance is the other role that's often always involved in the RFP process for audit services. And that's particularly with the central finance folks that are probably going to oversee the contract. I believe the exception would be with some larger governments out there that do have an internal auditor that may be an elected official that is responsible for being the primary person responsible for the audit contract. But in our practice, we mainly see central finance is involved there. But I think the best RFP processes is when others are involved, and that includes management. When I'm thinking with management is those organizations that really have decentralized governments where they may have a number of different departments, say like a Health and Human Services department, a Public Works department, and those folks have their own finance individuals that will be working with the contracted auditor. I think it's important for them to be involved in the process, whether it's through the interview that's conducted towards the end or to provide information that ends up in the RFP. And then the fourth role is with the elected officials. Certainly if an elected audit position is going to hire the contracted auditor, they definitely need to be involved. But we have seen success where elected officials have audit committee members on a subcommittee, and they're involved in The interview process is probably the most frequent way where they either observe or actually are involved in asking questions and scoring the firm. So I think it's best to sort through those different roles, make sure they're involved in the process, that there's good communication there, and I think that's where we see the most success in hiring an external auditor.
Yeah, Kevin, one of the things that surprised me in the last several years is the desire of elected officials to be involved. Mostly we find that we work with very smart people who understand governmental GAAP, but they understand the audit process, and so they have their own ideas about the auditor selection. But elected officials, they're the ones sometimes that are out in the public. If there is a finding, sometimes they're either held to account or have to deal with that, and they want to be able to sleep at night. And so it's interesting that we've seen a lot more interest by elected officials to be involved in the selection process.
Yeah, good point. I think one thing to really incorporate in the RFP to improve the chance of success with getting the right external auditor is to really consider the organization's values and make sure that those ring true in the RFP document. It's very rare that the external auditors are able to meet with finance management during the RFP. Once that hits the street, there's usually rules that say that discussion cannot occur. And it's really important to have the RFP spell out what the organization is after above and beyond just the scope of services of issuing the audit report, doing the single audit, and other engagements that may be in there. So I think technical expertise is something that we hear our clients say that they really value, making sure they understand just how involved their external auditor is with standard setters. Are you on an AICPA committee? Do you have discussions with GASB accounting standards setters, with the Office of Management and Budget that are heavily involved in single audit auditing standards and compliance requirements there? Is the firm have not just those people involved at the national level? You could have one or two individuals, but does that ring true to the rest of the organization? Are there managers at the audit firm that are also plugged into government auditing? Are the staff trained on a regular basis such that they will have experience auditing a government that's very similar to yours? I know our clients much prefer having auditors that can walk and talk GASB accounting standards. That's definitely a big win. So I think that's something you really want to spell out in the RFP as being a value that's of importance. We also hear that obviously, I think there's a standard that all CPAs are going to be professional. That's something that's very expected up front. But also there's a human element. Your auditor is going to be flexible when issues arise. We often look at numbers as being black and white, but we know there's estimates involved. There's delays that occur just because things come up. Obviously, we're seeing that now with COVID-19, having to deal with moving the timeline around. So is there flexibility in there? And it's really important to allow proposers a way to communicate how they're able to be professional and flexible at the same time. And then I think you also want your auditors to communicate how they're going to approach your government's audit. I think there'd be a concern if you're hiring a firm that goes with a one-size-fits-all approach. Some organizations have excellent internal controls, so your auditor can is probably going to want to rely on those controls to reduce the amount of work that happens. But if you have had issues with internal controls in the past, I don't think you want a firm that's just going to come in with a cookie cutter approach and only test internal controls when there really probably is higher risk that should be placed into substantive testing. So really hammering home that we require a good audit approach to be communicated in a successful proposal is also important in the RFP process.
You know, Kevin, one thing that surprised me on a recent proposal we did, Moss Adams, like many firms, is really making some big investments into technology. So software approaches, use of these database manipulation software programs. And we bid on a city, I won't name names, and we went in with an approach that was highly dependent on use of software. The benefit is that sometimes we're able to test 100% of an account balance without relying on sampling, so it's a lot more effective audit approach. And there's a lot less pulling of documents, a lot less effort by management to support our audit procedures. And we actually got rated down for that because they just maybe weren't as aware. They're used to sampling. They were used to the auditor saying, go pull, 40 evidences or 40 files and let us pour through there. So that was a little bit of a surprise. So one thing to think about is the level of technology, the level of effort required on your part, and what are your expectations, and perhaps that could come through in your evaluation criteria.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. And I think that's where having an interview, if successful firms with proposals are able to advance, sitting down and able to have those discussions often gives the audit firm a chance to explain further what they've written in the proposal, why there may be a different plan in place. Other values that organizations like to see from their auditor is, well, providing webinars like this. It's really important to get CPE. A lot of organizations have finance individuals that are CPAs. And, here at Moss Adams, I think Jim and I sometimes take for granted the CPE that we're able to receive. We have a lot of internal trainings where our folks are able to get government CPE internally. We also are able to go to national conferences. And in talking with our clients, they may only have the budget or the time to do one national conference a year, and one of those alone is not going to meet the CPE requirements. My wife is also in private practice, and I know she's always up against the gun. That last month of the 2-year cycle, somehow getting 80 hours of CPE within 3 days is always a head scratcher, but that's the pressure out there if you're not working with a CPA firm. So we like to help organizations and offer these sorts of webinars where we can talk about things that are above and beyond just the new accounting standards and internal control recommendations, things like cyber attacks, things like COVID-19, some of the federal money that's out there now. Jim just did a piece on that. Some of you may have seen. I thought was interesting. What other offerings outside of just the regular compliance audit are being offered? So having an opportunity to talk about those additional services in the proposal is very, very much appreciated. And here's an example of a scoring that I think really was valued-based. It talked about not only in the RFP what the organization valued, but it really lined up with the scoring criteria as well. You can see the subtotal before the interview was 110 total points, and of the 110, only 15 went to the cost. So If you look at qualifications of the firm, the expertise of the staff, the audit approach, that was 70 of the 110 before you got to the interview process. Also 10 points in there for references. I know that's something that Jim and I really appreciate. I think we take a lot of pride in our client service, and we, I think, are disappointed when we propose and then hear that no references were checked during the proposal process. Now, I understand that can take time to reach out and connect with folks. People may be tied up, busy, on vacation, and it can be difficult to call those references, but I think it is something that is valuable because it's one thing to read a proposal, but it's another thing to actually hear firsthand from organizations like yourself how it is to work with a particular audit firm. And then
I guess, Kevin, really,
the interview.
You know, one thing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'll let you go, Jim.
Okay, sorry, I thought you were done. One thing that really what we're trying to communicate here is whatever you value in the process, make sure that that is clearly demonstrated in the RFP, the type of information you request, and the point awards. I mean, obviously a fee is the most critical factor. You want to put the highest points towards that. But the main thing we're just trying to communicate is try very hard to provide objectively determined criteria that you value and point awards that get you to that. So the things that are important to you really get the highest point awards, and it makes the process a little more objective from your part and the proposer's part, and you achieve then those things that are very important to you. That's the main point.
Yeah, and I would say that cost 15 out of the total 140, that's really low. I think I've seen it generally more in the 20%, maybe 25, 30. 30 is about as high as I've seen it. I think that's much more common. So it is important to spell that out. And I think we have a polling question, Kendall.
All right, for our second polling question, we have, which of these do you value the most in differentiating evaluation criteria between audit firms? A, we value a firm's connections with the accounting, auditing standard setters. B, we rely on references to confirm a firm's technical expertise. C, we rely on references to confirm individual team members have the requisite experience. Or D, we value the firm's ability to provide additional education opportunities to our organization. As a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. We'll leave it open here just a few more seconds.
I know, we should have a little music here. Something.
All right, back to you, Kevin.
Let's see, and so the high score is we rely on references to confirm a firm's technical expertise. That's great news. Like to hear that. Also, accounting standard setters, that's also something that we like to see. And Jim, I think you've got the next slide. Okay,
very good. You know, it's interesting that we get to work with some really smart people. I'm not surprised anymore just how talented finance staff is of the various governments that we get an opportunity to work with. Sometimes that level of competency and confidence, though, factors into a decision about what firm to select without perhaps thinking about the needs of other parties. We mentioned elected officials, so you know, something that I'm pleased about is just the experience we've had where more and more of them want to be involved in the selection process, and that's really been great. Really appreciated that. They want to be able to sleep at night. So finance staff may be very confident, competent, but elected officials want to also feel good about the auditor selection so they know they've got a qualified firm in there that can really kick the tires and help. Also citizens. Citizens want transparency, so they have a stake in it. They don't always voice that or have an opportunity to, but and then another one that's often overlooked are financial analysts. One thing that became clear to me as I had opportunities to work nationally with the GASB and the AICPA on the state and local government expert panel is how many people read your financial statements. I got to work with financial analysts when I served on the GASB's advisory council, and they really pay attention to who the auditor is. Once you sell a bond, I mean, from a finance standpoint, you go through all that effort to get a bond sold and out there, you receive the proceeds, and then it's very little annual effort to do the filings through EMA and so forth without realizing that those bonds often are bought and sold in secondary markets. People are making pricing decisions that affect the interest they earn on those securities based on that pricing, and it's often financial analysts for banks and others that are doing that work, and they're relying on your statements. Pretty interesting lawsuit for City of Miami a few years ago where the SEC sued and won over some issues there. We won't have time to go into all of it, but just realize that there are others out there that rely on this. And then also finance and audit committees. Audit committees are a best practice. We have a number of them within our client base, but not all of you have audit committees. So a best practice is to have one and then also make sure that their interests are considered in the process. In terms of resources, just wanting you to know that there is, the AICPA has a resource out there that walks through the various things that Kevin and I are talking about and perhaps some things that, some additional concepts, but there are some resources out there to help you in this whole process. And with that, maybe we could go to the next polling question. Kendall?
All right, for our third polling question, we have, which of these challenges or other feedback have you recently received from firms in past audit RFP processes? A, firms want direct access to finance staff for information to assist with proposal development. B, we get requests to provide prior year fees. C, firms want at least 4 weeks to develop proposals. Or D, firms are not able to tell from the RFP if we require them to draft the financial statements or how we are able to take responsibility for them. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts to the right of the slide view. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. We'll leave the poll up here for a little bit longer. All right, back to you, Jim.
Okay. Yeah, that's not surprising to me. Firms want direct access to finance staff. That's kind of been my, obviously we, to me, to put a very effective proposal together, we really need to understand the different operating cycles, the different activities of an organization, and how do we develop an audit approach. In a perfect world, we would already have a pretty good assessment of whether there are good controls in place and can we rely on them. As Kevin mentioned earlier, could we put a lot of audit evidence in our audit bag through reliance on controls? And if we can't, then already you're going to be in more of a substantive audit approach phase, a lot more sampling perhaps, or use of tools to dig into the details of an account balance. And so you have to have a pretty good understanding of the approach to develop the hours, and then the hours then result in the fees. And so having access to finance staff, and I've actually been heartened, Kevin, in the last couple RFPs we received, there actually was a section in there that said if you have technical questions about the scope of the work, here's someone from finance that you can contact and ask questions. In addition to the contact from purchasing on how you get technical questions about responding to the proposal. So very heartened that that was there. And with Kevin, why don't you walk us through a few more provisions here for proposers?
Yeah, Jim, that's great when we're able to get that kind of access. Oftentimes, it'll be at more of a bidders conference environment where 5 firms sit down with finance management, and then there's the purchasing persons there kind of as a chaperone at a high school dance. And that's always a little awkward. So when we can have that direct access to the finance folks, I think is the biggest win for getting needs met for both sides. But here's the things that really we're interested in seeing in order to come up with an accurate total for the hours and the fee that's going to be proposed. You know, how big is the organization? How many departments does it have? You know, outside of central finance, are there different locations that we need to go to? Are there capital projects 2 hours away on a logging road we might need to observe? Really, what's the geography of the organization, and how many department heads, different finance folks throughout the organization are we likely going to meet with? IT is a big piece, and we'll talk more about that with City of Bend. If there's something like a new ERP conversion, might not be happening in year 1 of the upcoming audit, but maybe in years 2 and 3. That's probably something that's going to require more effort for us as auditors, something our IT professionals are going to be interested in spending more time on to understand how that impacts internal controls. And then also if you are a organization that does seek assistance from your auditor in drafting the financial statements, that's different from one organization to the other. So it's really important to walk through when we say drafting assistance, what does that entail? It's important for auditors to make sure that there's not going to be any issues with independence, no journal entries being made, not getting into making any sort of accounting entries, but making sure that we really understand the scope of drafting assistance.
Yeah, one thing that continues to surprise me, Kevin, are the number of RFPs we get where they refer to the annual document that is put out there and audited as the audit, as if that document is an audit or the audit. The document is really the annual financial statements, which is a responsibility of management. The audit is demonstrated by our opinion, you know, just the 2 or 3 or 4 pages that we stick in there as our contribution. So the RFP really needs to be clear. Are we asking the auditor to draft the statements, or what is the level of effort needed there, so they can really understand and put their hours in their bid together. And there's a number of RFPs that come still to this day that really are intending for the auditor to draft, but that's not clearly demonstrated in the language that's used.
Yeah, that can be very confusing indeed. Something else with governmental entities is federal awards are very common, and as a result, need to perform an audit under uniform guidance to test the compliance with major federal programs. And the number of programs that require audit can change from year to year. 1 year, your entity may only require 1 major federal program, but in year 2, might need 3 programs to be audited. And I would say in general, it can be anywhere from 40, 50, maybe if there's a lot of eligibility testing to do, 60 hours to audit a major federal program. So that really increases the scope of the audit. And sometimes I see where we're giving a table in the RFP, and we're supposed to copy the table in our proposed audit fees, drop in hours and fees, but it doesn't really lend itself to talking about the change in fees and in hours when there is that additional work needed on the federal awards audit piece. So usually kind of put in italics, be aware that each additional program is X dollars, but if not every bidding firm is thinking that way, I think that can skew how hours and audit fees can look from one proposal to the next. The audit timeline, this is one that Jim and I successfully responded to in the past year, but it was a very quick timeline. As people that focus on government audits, March is usually a slower time for Jim and myself. So from that perspective, it was good. We didn't have a lot of client work to do to respond to this proposal. As you can see, the RFP was issued March 14th, and then it was due about 2 weeks later. I often take actually some vacation time during March. So you can imagine if I'm out for a week, I might only have a week to respond. You know, fortunately with Jim around, we have other colleagues in Moss Adams to help out. But I think for a smaller firm, if they were to turn around a proposal within 2 weeks, that's asking a lot. So I think the minimum that I like to see is 3 weeks, and then anything more than that is very much appreciated.
Yeah, I'd say 4 weeks is really a nice target, and I guess a lot of it depends on are you really anxious to obtain information that's helpful for you to determine if a firm meets what you value, and it takes time for a firm to put that proposal together, and you want to be able to see through the proposal if you're getting what it is that you value. And 2 weeks really is not adequate time for a firm to do the work necessary to really demonstrate that they understand you, they took the time to understand you, and put together a quality proposal. So, yeah, my kind of thought is almost, are they even interested in a new firm getting the work? Because it seems like the incumbent firm has a huge advantage when there's a small window of time. But in this case here, we were the new firm and we did get the new work. Want to take it away, Jim? Okay, well, let's go to Kendall, if you would help us through the next polling question.
All right, for our fourth and final polling question, we have, how much time do you typically give audit firms to submit a proposal from the time the RFP is released? Options are A, 4 weeks or less, B, 4 to 6 weeks, C, 6 to 8 weeks, or D, something more than 8 weeks. Once you have completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. And we'll leave this open here for just a few more seconds.
Yeah, that one proposal, Kevin, I think the other reason we were successful in that is that was one that was kind of on your radar. You knew that was likely coming up to bid, so we had a chance to talk about it in advance. We were kind of anticipating that one was coming up, and so we were already prepared. I think the 2-week window was a little bit of a surprise, but I don't know, if you hadn't been tracking the likelihood that was coming up for bid, we probably would not have been able to meet that timeline.
Yeah, also helped it was well written. I don't think there's anything odd in it to address.
Yeah. So very happy
to see. 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kevin.
4 to 6 weeks is common, so I think that aligns with what Jim and I like to see. That definitely gives us enough time to provide a good response to RFP.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on. So I mentioned at the start that over the last about 5 years or so, the AICPA has been collecting a number of issues that audit firms have brought up about the contract provisions that are creating some challenges, and Moss Adams has experienced this in spades as well. And so what we want to share with you is most of you, in fact, a lot of you are CPAs, you might have been on our side of the table, you're very sensitive to some of these issues, but when procurement is responsible for the process and the contracting, they're not always aware of the professional standards that CPAs have to follow, and the contract language might be very similar to what they're asking from other professionals in different settings. So they're not respectful of the standards and the unique environment that we operate. One of the things that we get challenged is that our contracts often require access to work papers. Management, they say we want management to have access. Some of this may be holdovers back in the day when maybe the CPA was a little more involved in preparing source documents or support for account balances. Some of it is just not respectful of the fact that if management had complete access to our work papers, they would be able to see our audit plan. If our audit plan is documented to meet the spirit and intent of the standards, in there will be information about how we're going to approach the audit, what our tolerable error levels are, what types of surprise audit activities are we going to do, what's our assessment of fraud risks. There are certain things there that are just not appropriate for management. And so we have to be careful that what should be in the contract is access to our deliverables. Clearly, you don't want us to hold up the deliverable when you otherwise would be entitled to it, but the work papers is something that we need to, it's fine for internal audit. Any of you that have internal audit departments that are independent of management, that's okay. We want to work with internal auditors. So anyway, there's an issue there to work through. Ownership of work papers and work product. Some want ownership of any of the intellectual property, and that's created some issues. It's clearly you want ownership of our opinions and reports when they're issued, and you don't want us to hold up your ability to issue the report once we've signed it and handed it off. But some of them are asking for our intellectual property as well. Indemnity clauses. Obviously, you want to hold us accountable if we don't follow professional standards. But oftentimes we see clauses in there that ask us to be responsible even for acts of management or certain areas that create an independence problem. When you follow that through the AICPA and the government audit standards independence requirements, it creates a problem. And so that has to be carefully worded so that you capture what you want. You want the auditor to be held accountable if they don't follow professional standards, but not necessarily indemnifying the entity for acts of management. And finally, we're seeing more and more where there are elements in there where there's a desire to control what staff are assigned. We try very hard if we have someone on a job, it's just not working, you're not comfortable, that we listen and we're fortunate we have a deep bench, but not all firms are. But if you could control the staff, that also might give you the ability to get the outcomes that you might desire. And so you have to be careful on that front as well. Yeah, Kevin kind of mentioned this first one. We have some RFPs, not so much in Oregon, some of the other states that we operate in, we get RFPs where the single audit portion is generally a one fee, and then there's an expectation the firm will live with that one fee. Back in the ARA days, we had some clients that went from 5 or 6 normal major programs requiring audit to 12 to 13. It doubled the scope of the single audit. If a firm is unable to scale the fee for the level of effort, it encourages cutting corners, and it puts a little bit of undue pressure on the audit firm. Likewise, if you bid based on a certain number of programs and you have less than that, wouldn't you like the ability for your fee to drop? And so best practice is to allow a scaling of the effort for the scope of the work required, and that's an easy area to allow for. And then I mentioned this earlier, but yeah, when the contract document when the folks that put it together are not respectful or understanding of the unique elements in both AICPA and governmental audit standards. Go ahead, Kevin. Maybe we could talk a little bit about our City of Bend's experience.
Yeah, we'll dig into that. This is a client that I was eyeing for a number of years, and we were fortunate to meet with their finance folks before the RFP came out, so that was very helpful. And I'll also say that they probably one of the two best RFPs I have read before. After we got the work, I kept referring back as we were preparing our audit planning documentation. There were just so many goodies in that document that really helped us answer questions throughout that process. So the timeline was pretty memorable for me because I think Jim and I had just issued a number of audits right before the Christmas holiday, and I received the RFP about 4:30 p.m. on Friday, December 23rd. So I was just shutting down my computer for the next several days. It came in, but I was fortunate and happy to see that it was not going to be due until January 25th. We do have clients that unfortunately need to extend from time to time. There seem to be one or two every year. So we can get busy in January to issue a few more audits that are due January 31. But this timing worked out because when we get back from the holidays is a good time to work on proposals. And then the fact it wasn't due on the 31st, a week before some of those extended audits needed to be done, was very helpful. Now, if you walk through this, interviews were done at the end of February, so that was about a month after the proposals were due, and they stay on track there. I think they put some time into checking references, talking to folks throughout the city, and elected officials were included on this. The mayor was actually in on the interview call. I don't believe the mayor was involved in the scoring, but was observing the call. And that was very interesting, and the city finance folks really enjoyed the mayor being involved as well. Now, the contract actually wasn't awarded until June. That worked out just fine because they didn't want their audit firm to be on site to do initial work until July. So that timing worked out, and I would say this is probably a little more stretched out than I'm used to seeing, but they hit their marks, what they set out to do, and it worked well. What they use for exchanging documents with proposers is something called the Premier Builders Exchange. I'll say it was an unusual site to use in that when you get in there, it's very much what it sounds like. It's a little more geared towards builders. I believe there's pictures of architects laying out plans. There's a guy with a hard hat on carrying a 2x4. It doesn't look like something a financial services company would be looking for RFPs, but that's where the City of Bend puts all theirs. And I hear that their contract manager has been interested in changing to a different site. They actually wouldn't recommend this site to other organizations. They think something like what the state of Oregon has, the Orpin site would be something that would be a better tool to use. But what I commonly see is going to a government's procurement website, and really just that page is where information is exchanged. But the city was using this Premier Builders Exchange site, and I believe they still do to this day. All that interesting information in their RFP, a lot of that's here. They did an excellent job talking about the different departments at the city. The fact that there were 2 other audits required. They have an urban renewal agency that's a blended component unit. And then they're also responsible for doing the books for the Bend Metro Planning Organization. And so they explained what the auditor needed to do to meet that requirement. They were also had some good information about what they get in federal awards. Now, cities in Oregon don't always have enough in federal awards to require a single audit every year, and theirs can fluctuate from 1 to 2 major federal programs. So they talked about how sometimes their airport will get money, they'll get fire equipment, they have utilities projects. So they did a good job explaining what the audit firm can expect there. And also, they did a big IT ERP conversion. So that was really valuable information to hear kind of what the timing would be on that, when they expected to do the change in their payroll system, in their vendor payment system. And we were really able to build that into our proposal and explain why our hours were where they were at. In the process, finance was able to answer technical questions. That's very helpful. And I think there were a couple of addendums in there that were more contract-related questions. I think those of you who are used to the audit RFP process commonly see the same 5 or 7 questions that firms ask, things like, what were prior year audit fees? Did you have any disagreements? Is the prior audit firm able to bid? And I think the city baked a lot of that into their RFP, so those sorts of questions didn't need to be answered again.
And Kevin, we'll go through the rest pretty quick. I see we're down to our last 3 or 4 minutes here, but just wanting to point out that they did have a number of pass, no pass provisions that are kind of listed here. So a firm had to meet these to go on. And then they had very objective criteria. One of the things we liked is they had a point award and they had information that was very clear about what they cared about. In fact, they took each of these sections and even broke down the point award even more. You can see one thing that really appealed to them was the efficiency of the audit techniques. You know, no one wants to be hit with a ton of requests for paper and files and documents and time. So they were hopeful that a firm had some electronic tools, but whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is they had very objective criteria. The point awards kind of matched what they cared about, and they followed through with that in their scoring. And you'll have these materials when you download them, so you can kind of see how the firms came out and how they were able to establish these criteria. And then also, Kevin, back to you. You had mentioned earlier just the interview process, and that was a pretty fun process for them as well.
Yeah, it was about 10 minutes to do our firm's introduction, talk about the transition plan, and then I believe there was one other firm that was in the running. We both got 4 standard questions that you see there. And then they had some follow-up questions that were specific to our proposals. I believe they were asking about our hours, and then that gave us a chance to talk about how we built in additional time to handle their ERP conversion. They also have an audit committee that has, I believe, it consists of 3 of the 7 elected officials, one being the mayor. So we got to learn a lot about that process, and it was good to see that they had the elected officials involved. The other services that we've worked with them on, we have done a room tax occupancy engagement. That's something that went out to bid just like the audit. And they've valued seeking advice outside the audit and training opportunities like these very much.
Yeah, and then last thing that we had, again, I mentioned early on that a number of you have identified some real value to you in a number of other areas. One is attestation engagements. You might be, or some of you have law enforcement districts. A lot of counties do. Lane County in particular was faced with putting, convicted folks out of jail. They just didn't have room. And they went for a special property tax levy to expand the capacity of the jail and hang on to more of the folks that they were arresting. And they put in the tax levy request a requirement for an audit to make sure that they, in fact, were operating the additional beds. I know with City of Portland, there's a number of things, a Fix Our Streets program that had an Attest element that went in the ballot measure to get the tax approved. There are construction audits that are helping with construction bonds. So there are a number of other areas our clients are coming to us and saying, can you help us meet the community expectations so that we can get these resources to do these needed services? So a firm's ability to meet your needs in these other areas might be a more and more important criteria to consider. And I know we're about out of time for questions, but Kendall, if people have questions, what could they do at this point?
Yep, so unfortunately we are out of time today, but thank you, Jim and Kevin, for a great presentation. If you submitted a question that we did not get to, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast, or you may reach out to the presenters directly. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next time.